They say behind every outlaw, there's a story waiting to be told. But behind this one, there was a woman, sharp as a switchblade, calm as a poker face, and far more dangerous than the man with the gun. Before the newspapers ever printed the name Machine Gun Kelly, there was Kathryn Kelly, the mind that built the legend, the whisper that turned into a roar. The story begins not in a smoky bar or a getaway car, but in a quiet town under the Oklahoma sun. The year was 1904. Kathryn Thorne grew up in a world that seemed too small for her ambition. Her family wasn't rich, but she had a taste for fine things. Silk, perfume, the kind of luxury that never came easy in those dust-blown streets. Her father was a restless man, her mother a stern woman, and Kathryn learned early that charm could open doors that money couldn't. Even as a girl, she had a spark, the kind that could either light up a room or burn it down. She was quick with a smile and quicker with a plan. Teachers called her bright but distracted. Neighbors called her trouble waiting to happen. But to Kathryn, the world was a chessboard, and she intended to learn how to play every piece. When the Roaring Twenties swept across America, bringing jazz, liquor, and chaos in equal measure, Kathryn saw opportunity. Men went wild chasing the American dream, and women, for the first time, began to rewrite their own rules. Shorter skirts, louder voices, bigger risks, and Kathryn was no exception. She had already left behind 2 failed marriages and carried herself like a woman who'd learned something dangerous about power. By the time she crossed paths with a small-time bootlegger named George Kelly Barnes, she wasn't looking for love. She was looking for potential. George was handsome enough, sure, but what caught her attention wasn't his looks. It was his hunger. He was a man trying to outrun his own mediocrity, desperate for a name that mattered. And Kathryn, ever the visionary, saw exactly what he could become. In the smoky corners of a Tulsa speakeasy, their story began, not with fireworks but with quiet calculation. Kathryn leaned across the table, her eyes steady, her voice low. She didn't flirt. She commanded. And by the time the night was over, George Kelly Barnes had fallen under her spell. She taught him to dress sharper, to speak with confidence, to carry himself like a man of legend. It wasn't long before she gave him something more, a name. Machine Gun Kelly. It rolled off the tongue like danger wrapped in charm, and Kathryn knew that names could build myths faster than bullets could tear them down. But let's rewind for a moment. Before the fame, before the chaos, Kathryn's life had already been a slow burn toward infamy. She dabbled in forgery, smuggling, and petty scams. She had a knack for finding trouble and talking her way out of it. In another life, she might have been a politician or a CEO. But this was Prohibition America, and ambition like hers had nowhere respectable to go. So she carved her own empire, one scheme at a time. The law was just another game, and Kathryn always played to win. She was no cold-hearted villain, though. To those who knew her well, she had a strange magnetism, loyal to her circle, protective of her man, and fiercely intelligent. Her laughter could disarm even the toughest gangsters, and her temper could silence them just as fast. She had a way of making people believe in her vision, and that, more than anything, was her true weapon. When George came into her life, he was just another outlaw with a gun. But Kathryn molded him into something bigger. She encouraged him to take risks, to dream louder. She designed their image, the tailored suits, the fancy cars, the glamorous photographs that made headlines. Every heist, every kidnapping, every boast in the press, all of it was part of her carefully crafted narrative. The world saw Machine Gun Kelly as the embodiment of rebellion, the roaring thunder of the gangster age. But those who looked closer saw Kathryn's fingerprints on every move. She wasn't just the woman behind the man. She was the architect behind the myth. And yet, deep down, she wasn't chasing chaos for chaos's sake. Kathryn wanted control. In a world that dismissed women as ornaments or sidekicks, she became the mind behind one of the most feared names in America. Her genius was hidden behind rouge and silk. Her strategy whispered over bourbon and gunpowder. In one famous story, it was Kathryn who insisted George carry his trademark machine gun, not for necessity, but for image. "They need to believe you're dangerous," she told him, lighting a cigarette with steady hands. "Fear is half the fight." George listened. He always did. Soon the Kellys became infamous, drifting from city to city in a haze of fast money and faster getaways. But in these early years, before the kidnappings and the headlines, there was a strange kind of harmony between them. Kathryn was the brain, George the brawn. Together, they made a storm that no one saw coming. Yet even then, there were cracks in the perfection. Kathryn's ambition was boundless, and George's ego began to swell under the weight of his new persona. She had created a legend, but legends have a way of consuming their makers. Still, for now, their names were whispered in smoky bars and shouted in newspaper headlines. To the world, Machine Gun Kelly was the wild outlaw America couldn't stop talking about. But to those in the know, it was Kathryn's steady hand guiding every move, every word, every shot fired. It's said that behind every successful man stands a woman. But in this case, she wasn't standing behind him. She was pulling the strings from the shadows. Kathryn Kelly didn't just live in the age of gangsters. She shaped it, one decision at a time, and as the night deepened and the jazz bands played on, Kathryn would sometimes sit by the window of a cheap motel room, cigarette smoke curling through the lamplight, watching her man polish his gun. Her eyes would linger, not with fear, but with calculation. Because in her mind, the real weapon wasn't in his hands. It was in hers. The world was roaring, the law was tightening, and America was teetering between glamour and chaos. But Kathryn Kelly had already made her choice. She would not be another forgotten woman in the margins of a man's story. She would be the story. And as fate would have it, she was just getting started. Love and crime often share the same heartbeat, quick, reckless, and impossible to stop once it starts. For Kathryn Kelly, love wasn't a soft feeling. It was power disguised as devotion. And for George Kelly Barnes, it was salvation, at least at first. By the early 1930s, America was a land of broken promises. The Great Depression had left men desperate, banks vulnerable, and lawmen thinly stretched. It was the perfect breeding ground for legends, and Kathryn knew it. She and George weren't just trying to survive. They were trying to become unforgettable. George had always been rough around the edges, a bootlegger with more nerve than sense. But Kathryn polished him like a diamond she'd found buried in mud. She picked out his suits, taught him to carry himself like a man of authority, and even drilled him on how to talk to reporters. He stopped being George Kelly Barnes, the petty crook, and became Machine Gun Kelly, the outlaw America couldn't look away from. It was Kathryn who first realized that image could be a weapon sharper than any gun. She started rumors, whispered stories of George's ruthlessness, his supposed army of gunmen, his icy control in a firefight. The more outrageous the story, the faster it spread. Soon the newspapers couldn't get enough. Machine Gun Kelly strikes again, the headlines screamed. The name had weight now. It echoed in speakeasies, pool halls, and sheriff's offices across the Midwest. And every time George saw his name in print, Kathryn smiled, the quiet, knowing smile of a puppeteer watching her marionette dance. Their partnership deepened with every heist. Kathryn wasn't content with small-time hustles. She wanted big scores, banks, payroll trucks, kidnappings that could shake the country. Together they formed a crew, a mix of bold men drawn to George's swagger and Kathryn's cunning. While George planned with bullets, Kathryn planned with words. She handled logistics, found safe houses, arranged payoffs, and even negotiated with corrupt officials. She didn't just stand by his side. She ran the operation from behind a pair of carefully plucked eyebrows and a disarming smile, but it wasn't all cold calculation. Somewhere between the adrenaline and the headlines, a strange kind of love took root. Kathryn and George fed off each other. Her ambition lit his courage. His loyalty fueled her control. They were fire and gasoline, inseparable and dangerous. At night, in their hideouts across Oklahoma and Texas, they'd sit together counting stacks of stolen cash, the lamplight dancing on their faces. George would crack a joke, Kathryn would roll her eyes. And for a fleeting moment, they looked like any other couple, until the distant sound of sirens reminded them who they really were. Then came the plan that would change everything. The kidnapping of Charles Urschel, a wealthy oil man from Oklahoma City. It was Kathryn's idea, bold, clean, and high reward. One job, she told George, and we'll never have to look over our shoulders again. She was tired of scraping by, tired of hiding. She wanted a payday that would make history. And so, in the summer of 1933, The Kelly gang executed one of the most famous kidnappings in American history. Kathryn orchestrated every detail, from the fake names and getaway routes to the coded messages for ransom collection. When Urschel was taken from his home at gunpoint, George barked orders. But it was Kathryn who made sure no trace was left behind. While Urschel was held captive in a remote farmhouse, Kathryn took care of him personally. She was polite, even warm at times, offering him food and conversation. But her eyes told another story, a woman who could be merciless if she had to. Urschel later said it wasn't the gun that scared him most. It was the intelligence behind it. The ransom was set at $200,000, a staggering sum in Depression-era America. And when the money was finally delivered, Kathryn's plan worked flawlessly. They were rich beyond imagination. For a brief golden moment, the Kellys stood at the pinnacle of their infamy. But glory is a fragile thing. The more they flaunted their success, the more attention they drew. George, high on fame, began to believe his own legend. He strutted through towns with his signature Thompson submachine gun, boasting to anyone who'd listen. Kathryn, ever composed, warned him to stay quiet, to keep moving. But the line between legend and reality had already blurred. Behind closed doors, the tension grew. George's drinking worsened, and Kathryn's patience thinned. She had created a myth, and now she was losing control of it. The man she once molded into a symbol of power was becoming unpredictable. Still, she couldn't walk away. Whether it was love or obsession, Kathryn was bound to him. Together they had built something too big to abandon, a name carved into the nation's fear. Then came the turning point, a single mistake that would send everything spiraling. The ransom bills from the Urschel kidnapping were carefully marked by the FBI. As the money circulated, agents began tracing it back, piece by piece, to the Kellys' network. Safe houses were raided, associates were arrested, and the noose began to tighten. Kathryn sensed it before George did. She packed their bags before dawn, urging him to run, but he hesitated, drunk on his own bravado. "They'll never catch Machine Gun Kelly," he bragged, slamming his fist on the table. Kathryn didn't argue, but her eyes said it all. Pride was a luxury they could no longer afford. The chase stretched across states, every mile a reminder that their empire was built on borrowed time. They switched cars, changed names, hid in motels with curtains drawn tight. Kathryn remained composed, scribbling plans on scraps of paper while George paced, restless and angry. The cracks in their empire widened with every passing day. Kathryn could sense the walls closing in, but she refused to panic. She'd been the architect of their rise, and she would face the fall with the same steel in her spine. Still, there were moments, late at night, when the silence grew heavy. George would stare out the window, gun resting on his knee, and Kathryn would light a cigarette, the glow reflecting in her eyes. "We had a good run," she'd whisper. He wouldn't answer, but she knew he was thinking the same thing. They had danced too close to the fire, and now it was catching up to them. Their love, once their greatest strength, had become their weakness. Together they had built an empire out of fear and ambition, and together they would watch it begin to crumble. But that's the thing about legends. They rarely fade quietly. For Kathryn Kelly, the game wasn't over yet. The FBI might be closing in, but she still believed she could outthink them, outplay them, maybe even disappear altogether. After all, she'd turned a small-time crook into a national sensation. How hard could it be to vanish into the smoke? As the car sped through the dark Oklahoma backroads, Kathryn looked at the man beside her, the myth she had created. And for the first time, she wondered if she'd made a mistake. The road ahead was uncertain, the law just behind. And in that narrow space between power and downfall, Kathryn Kelly tightened her grip on her husband's arm and whispered, almost to herself, "Let's see if they can catch the legend." The Kellys had become America's most wanted couple, the outlaw king and queen of the Depression era. To the newspapers, they were icons of danger and desire. To the FBI, they were a growing embarrassment that had to be erased. But to themselves, Kathryn and George lived in the strange space between fame and fear, a dream built on stolen money and borrowed time. They moved through cities like ghosts, changing names as often as they changed cars. Chicago, Dallas, Memphis, each stop a new chapter in the legend they'd written with gunpowder and deceit. To the outside world, they were rich, reckless, and unstoppable. But the truth behind the curtains was more complicated. Kathryn loved the appearance of control. She kept the cash neatly bundled, the guns oiled and ready, and George looking sharp in his tailored suits. Every time they walked into a hotel lobby, heads turned. She was elegance, he was danger, and together they were a spectacle. People whispered, wondering who they really were. Some saw celebrities, others saw something darker. George basked in it. He'd grown addicted to the myth Kathryn had built around him. He strutted through life as Machine Gun Kelly, tossing around his new persona like a crown. He bought expensive liquor, silk ties, and flashy cars, the kind of luxury that screamed defiance in an era when most Americans could barely afford bread. Kathryn, however, saw it differently. She didn't crave the spotlight. She craved control. The glamour was a mask, a distraction to hide the cracks in their operation. Behind every glass of champagne, she was calculating their next move, balancing the thrill of power with the terror of exposure. For a while, they managed to keep the illusion alive. They stayed in grand hotels under false names, tipping bellboys with crisp bills from the ransom money. They laughed loud and lived fast, their story feeding off the attention it created. Wherever they went, rumors followed. Machine Gun Kelly had outsmarted the FBI again, robbed another bank, escaped another ambush, but glamour, like smoke, always fades. The first real sign of trouble came when one of their crew members, tired of running, started talking too much. A small leak, a careless remark in a bar, a boast to the wrong person, and suddenly the FBI had new leads. Names, locations, even the possibility that the Kellys were hiding in the South. Kathryn sensed the shift immediately. She began burning letters, shredding photos, and keeping a loaded pistol under her pillow. Every knock on the door sent a chill through her spine. Still, she refused to show fear. To George, to their crew, she remained calm, almost regal. "We stay sharp," she'd say, her voice steady. "They'll expect panic. We give them control." But control was slipping through her fingers, and deep down she knew it. George, meanwhile, was unraveling. The pressure, the endless running, and the constant drinking began to eat away at his confidence. He'd sit up late at night, polishing his machine gun, muttering that they were untouchable, as if saying it enough times might make it true. Kathryn watched him quietly. The man she had turned into a legend was starting to believe the legend too much. And legends, as she'd always known, die faster than men. Still, she stood by him. Loyalty wasn't just love for her, it was identity. Without George, there was no Machine Gun Kelly. Without Kathryn, there was no story. To keep morale high, Kathryn turned danger into performance. When they traveled, she dressed the part, elegant hats, pearls, gloves. George followed suit, playing the role of the dashing outlaw. They were like movie stars trapped in a crime reel, their every move choreographed to perfection. But beneath the glamour, paranoia grew like a shadow. Every siren in the distance made George flinch. Every stranger's glance made Kathryn reach for her purse, where her revolver rested quietly. They were still making money, but it no longer brought joy. Each stolen dollar carried the weight of another risk. Each night in a hotel felt like their last. One evening in Memphis, while hiding under false names, Kathryn sat at the edge of the bed, her cigarette burning low. George paced the floor, restless and irritable. "They'll never stop," he muttered. "They'll keep coming till they get us." Kathryn blew out a slow stream of smoke. "Then we make them think they already did." He looked at her, confusion flickering in his eyes. "We disappear," she said softly. "No more headlines, no more Machine Gun Kelly, just silence." But George couldn't let it go. He'd become addicted to the legend, the fame, the fear, the power. He couldn't go back to being no one. That night, Kathryn realized something terrifying. She'd created a monster she could no longer control. Still, she played the role. Loyal wife, criminal strategist, the calm in the storm. When agents came too close, she packed their bags before dawn. When George drank himself into despair, she cleaned his gun and whispered plans for a new escape. The glamour they once flaunted now became armor. Every smile hid exhaustion, every laugh masked fear. Meanwhile, the FBI tightened the net. J. Edgar Hoover himself had taken a personal interest in bringing them down. To the Bureau, catching Machine Gun Kelly wasn't just another arrest. It was a statement of power. Posters with their faces appeared across the country. Informants traded information for cash. The press, once obsessed with the legend, now feasted on the chase. America wanted the Kellys caught, dead or alive. Kathryn read the headlines each morning with a strange detachment. FBI on trail of Machine Gun Kelly. Public enemy number one. She had dreamed of power, and now it stared back at her from every newspaper stand. It was everything she'd wanted, and everything she'd come to fear. Still, she didn't falter. If the world wanted a villain, she would give them one worth remembering. One night, as they hid out in a friend's farmhouse, George stood at the window, gun in hand. Kathryn joined him, resting a hand on his shoulder. The silence stretched between them, heavy, final. "We had a good run," he said quietly. Kathryn didn't reply. Her mind was elsewhere, already calculating their next move, their next alias, their next breath of freedom. But deep down, she felt it, the end creeping closer. The glamour was gone now, replaced by exhaustion and dread. The gun smoke that once smelled like victory now reeked of inevitability. They had built an empire of fear and fascination, and now they were trapped inside it. Every choice, every risk, every moment of defiance had led them here, fugitives of their own making. In the distance, thunder rolled across the plains, a warning from the heavens. Kathryn looked out into the night and whispered to herself, "Nothing gold lasts forever." And she was right. The Kellys' story had burned bright. But all flames, no matter how beautiful, eventually consume themselves. The end came not with a gunfight or a grand escape, but with whispers, the quiet kind that move faster than bullets. By late 1933, the Kellys' empire was collapsing from the inside out. The ransom money that once bought them luxury now marked their every move. Every banknote, every bribe, every flash of cash left a trail, and the FBI followed it like hounds on blood. They were hiding in Memphis now, using the name George and Kathryn Black. The house they rented on Marquette Street looked ordinary. A small, sun-faded home surrounded by sycamore trees. The kind of place where neighbors waved, kids rode bicycles, and no one suspected a thing. But behind those walls, tension coiled like a live wire. George was drinking heavier than ever, the weight of paranoia pressing down on him. He cleaned his gun obsessively, muttering about betrayal and bad luck. Kathryn tried to hold things together, keeping the blinds drawn, managing their dwindling funds, writing letters in code to their dwindling circle of contacts. But she could feel it too. The walls closing in. The FBI was watching. They had informants scattered across the South, listening, tracing, waiting. The name Machine Gun Kelly was no longer just a headline. It was a mission. J. Edgar Hoover wanted a trophy, and the Kellys were perfect prey. Kathryn could sense the danger long before the agents made their move. The strange cars parked a little too long down the block. The nervous stares from their landlord. The growing silence from old allies. It all pointed to one truth. Someone had talked, and that someone was already cashing a federal paycheck. It was George's old acquaintance, Robert Shannon, who finally sold them out. He tipped off the FBI, giving them the exact address, the layout of the house, and even the time when the Kellys usually slept. For that betrayal, he'd get a lighter sentence, and the Kellys would lose their freedom. It was September 26, 1933. The night air was heavy with heat and tension. Inside the small Memphis home, Kathryn sat by the window, staring into the darkness. She hadn't slept in days. George snored faintly in the next room, a half-empty whiskey bottle glinting in the lamplight. She listened, always listening, for that sound she feared most. Then it came, a low rumble of engines, the crunch of tires on gravel. Voices, quiet, disciplined, purposeful. Kathryn froze. In an instant her mind mapped the house, the exits, the guns. But before she could move, a shout split the silence. FBI! Come out with your hands up! The trap had closed. For a moment time seemed to stop. George stumbled from the bedroom, eyes wide, gun in hand. Kathryn grabbed his arm. "Don't," she hissed. Not now. But George was trembling, caught between pride and fear. The legend of Machine Gun Kelly, the fearless outlaw, was crumbling right there on the kitchen floor. The agents surrounded the house, rifles trained on every door and window. Spotlights flooded the yard, slicing through the dark. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains as the scene unfolded like something out of a newsreel. Kathryn, ever the strategist, knew resistance was suicide. She turned to George, her voice calm, almost tender. "Put it down," she said. "It's over." For a long second, he didn't move. Then, with shaking hands, he lowered the gun. From outside came another command. "Come out slow, hands where we can see 'em." The door creaked open, and out stepped the infamous Machine Gun Kelly, unarmed, terrified, and stripped of the myth his wife had built around him. Kathryn followed close behind, her face expressionless under the glare of the lights. As they hit the ground, hands behind their heads, an agent shouted the words that would echo through history. "Don't shoot." "G-Man's got him!" It was the birth of a new term, G-Man, short for government man, a nickname that would forever be tied to their capture. Ironically, the phrase came from George himself. Drunk, defeated, and desperate, he'd supposedly shouted, "Don't shoot, G-Man! Don't shoot!" as he surrendered. The newspapers ran with it, and overnight, Machine Gun Kelly became a symbol of a dying gangster age, the first great outlaw to fall to the power of federal law. Inside the police car, as the handcuffs tightened around her wrists, Kathryn sat silent. George was rambling beside her, alternating between anger and despair. But Kathryn's mind was somewhere else. She was already rewriting the ending in her head, searching for dignity in defeat. She'd built this legend from nothing, turned a small-time crook into a household name. Now that same legend had swallowed them both. At the station, the reporters were already waiting. Flashbulbs burst like fireworks, and the questions flew fast. "Is it true you planned the kidnappings? Who was really in charge? Was Machine Gun Kelly as ruthless as they say?" Kathryn didn't flinch. She looked right into the cameras and smiled faintly, the same smile that had once fooled gangsters, bankers, and lovers alike. "I'm just a wife," she said softly. "I followed my husband, but the agents knew better. The evidence, the letters, the money, the testimonies, all pointed to her as the mastermind. They called her the brains behind the gun, and in their eyes, George was just the weapon she'd aimed." During interrogation, she kept her composure. When questioned about her role, she gave vague answers, sometimes clever, sometimes cold. One agent later remarked, "She was the calmest woman I ever met in custody," like she'd already accepted her fate. In truth, Kathryn wasn't calm. She was thinking, always thinking. At trial, the prosecution painted her as the real architect of the Urschel kidnapping. The press loved it, the idea that behind the roaring machine gun stood a calculating woman who'd pulled the strings. Kathryn didn't deny it, not outright. She simply watched, chin lifted, as the jury decided her fate. When the verdict came, guilty on all counts, she didn't cry. George broke down, shouting that it wasn't fair, that she'd only done what any loyal wife would. But Kathryn remained still, almost regal in defeat. They were both sentenced to life in prison. As the train carried them away from the courtroom, bound for separate facilities, Kathryn looked out the window at the rolling countryside. The fields blurred past, golden under the afternoon sun. Somewhere out there were the same dusty Oklahoma roads where she'd grown up, where she'd dreamed of something greater. Now, that dream was gone, replaced by cold bars and gray walls, but deep inside, a flicker of pride remained. She had wanted to make history, and in her own way she had. The newspapers would remember her as the mastermind, the woman who turned a small-time crook into a national threat. The world would call her dangerous, cunning, manipulative. But Kathryn Kelly would call herself something simpler, unstoppable, until the very end. As night fell and the train clattered deeper into the darkness, she leaned back, closed her eyes, and whispered to no one. They wanted a legend. I gave them one. Outside, the world moved on. The FBI claimed victory, the headlines shifted, and the gangster age began to fade. But somewhere in the heart of that fading legend, Kathryn Kelly's name still lingered, a quiet reminder that sometimes the deadliest weapon in the room doesn't fire bullets. It thinks. The prison gates clanged shut behind Kathryn Kelly, and with that sound, an era ended. The roaring days of the 1930s outlaws, of Tommy guns, getaway cars, and headlines soaked in danger, were fading into history. Inside those gray walls, Kathryn traded silk and cigarettes for cotton uniforms and silence. But even here, the legend of Machine Gun Kelly and his wife, Kathryn, refused to die. At first, the guards whispered about her, The newspapers had painted her as a femme fatale, a criminal genius with eyes cold enough to stop a man mid-sentence. They expected arrogance, fury, maybe even violence. Instead, they found a woman who kept to herself, who read old magazines in the library and walked the yard with quiet dignity. Kathryn had always been a strategist, and now she turned that discipline inward. The chaos was gone. No police sirens, no plans scribbled on napkins, no thrill of the next escape, just time. Endless, echoing time. She filled it with thought, about choices, about power, about how easy it had been to mistake attention for respect. Sometimes she thought about George, her husband, her partner, her creation. In the men's prison down south, he'd become a ghost of himself, repeating the same words to anyone who would listen. "Don't shoot, G-men." That phrase had become his curse and his legacy. He was no longer Machine Gun Kelly, the outlaw. He was a punchline, a story parents told their kids about how crime never pays. But Kathryn, she was remembered differently. When reporters wrote retrospectives years later, they couldn't resist her image, the woman who masterminded the machine gun era. Some called her the power behind the pistol. Others said she was the real danger, the quiet mind steering the storm. And maybe, in some twisted way, they were right. Behind those prison bars, Kathryn Kelly learned what every architect of chaos eventually learns. That control is an illusion. She had played her part perfectly, but the world she built was made of smoke. One betrayal, one wrong turn, and the empire she engineered fell apart like a house of cards. Yet there was something admirable in her fall, something almost poetic. Unlike most criminals of her time, she didn't beg for mercy or weep for forgiveness. She accepted her fate with the same composure she'd shown when she orchestrated kidnappings and bribes. It wasn't pride, it was understanding. The game had rules, and she had simply lost. As the years passed, the outside world changed. Radios gave way to televisions. The Great Depression faded into memory. The age of the gangster turned into the age of the suit and tie. And while others chased new headlines, Kathryn remained a story caught in amber, a reminder of when crime had style and outlaws had mystique. Her name would appear in books and documentaries, usually beside George's. But those who looked closer always noticed the same thing. She was the one with the plan, the brains, the steel nerve. George might have pulled the trigger, but Kathryn had aimed the gun. In her final years behind bars, she grew quieter still. The sharpness in her eyes softened, replaced by something that looked almost like peace. Fellow inmates said she carried herself like a woman who had made peace with ghosts. Maybe she had. One cold morning, a guard found her sitting by the window, staring out at the distant fields. She wasn't reading or writing, just thinking, the way she always had. Some said she whispered a single line before the end. "They'll forget my crimes before they forget my name." And in a strange way, that came true. Years later, historians would argue about her. Was Kathryn Kelly truly the mastermind behind Machine Gun Kelly? Or was she simply a woman swept into a world that rewarded cunning more than compassion? The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. Kathryn was ambitious, intelligent, and dangerously charming, qualities that in another time might have made her a business magnate or politician. But in the rough world of the 1930s, with power traded in bullets and fear, those same qualities made her a criminal legend. She proved that in the age of gangsters, intelligence could be as deadly as gunfire. She didn't rob banks with force, she robbed them with foresight. She didn't lead with fear, she led with strategy. In a world dominated by men with weapons, Kathryn Kelly became the woman with a plan. Even the FBI couldn't help but respect her. Internal memos from the era described her as calculated, persuasive, and decisive. One agent reportedly said, if she'd been born in another time, she could have run a corporation instead of a racket. And maybe that's what makes her story so haunting. Kathryn Kelly wasn't just a criminal. She was a mirror reflecting what America was becoming. Ambitious, ruthless, and hungry for power. Today, her name might not echo as loudly as Bonnie Parker or Al Capone, but among those who study the criminal underworld, Kathryn Kelly remains a symbol of intelligence misused, of brilliance steered toward destruction. She was living proof that sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't a machine gun. It's a mind that refuses to yield. If you close your eyes, You can almost hear it. The low hum of a 1930s getaway car, the soft click of heels on a marble floor, the whisper of a woman's voice shaping destiny from the shadows. That was Kathryn Kelly, the brain behind the gunfire, the strategist who turned love into legend, the woman who taught America that every outlaw story has two sides, the one that pulls the trigger and the one that tells it where to aim. And as history fades and myths take their place, her shadow lingers, elegant, dangerous, unforgettable. So the next time you hear the name Machine Gun Kelly, remember the woman who made that name worth remembering. Because in the end, it wasn't the gun that built the legend. It was her. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more cinematic tales from the dark underworld of America's most notorious legends.